Welcome to the presentation of the 7th edition of the Global Health Watch report. And we are very pleased to have here the two editors of this 7th edition, Ron Laponte and Chiara Bodini. Ron is a friend and he has served for many years as professor and distinguished research chair in globalization and health equity at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He has held also several positions in Australia and the Netherlands, and along with his many academic duties and commitment, he has been exceptionally active over the past few years with the People Health Movement. And he is not only the co-editor of this present edition, but together with Chiara, he has edited also the 6th edition that was presented here in Bologna in October 2022. When Ron was actually here as a visit in ENISA, visiting the Institute of Advanced Study of the University of Bologna. His research interests moved from globalization and health equity, health promotion, primary care reforms, and assessment and evaluation of the impact of trade on health systems, global governance of infectious diseases. He has edited and authored more than 25 books, hundreds of articles. If I may suggest some of his most recent books, I will tell you Health Equity in a Globalizing Era, that was published in 2019 for Oxford University Press, and Revitalizing Health for All, and also Health Promotion in Action. Not to mention Critical Perspective in Public Health. So, I mean, he is really a crucial point of reference for those of us who are engaged in critical global health policy and research. Chiara Bodini is a sister, is a friend, is a colleague, and she officially a postdoc researcher at the Center for International Health here in Bologna. And she's a medical doctor. She has specialized in public health and infectious diseases. She holds a PhD in public health and also a specialization in medical anthropology. She is an activist. She works with Ron in the People Health Movement, but she's also an activist at the national level and at the international level, not only within the People Health Movement. She is exceptionally well known, and her interests again move from the analysis of the social determinants of health and social justice promotion, the action research, health reforms and social justice. What else? She is really a pillar of the Center for International Health, even because she was among the very founding group back in 2006 of the very center. I'm not going to waste time. We have the QR code for downloading the 7th edition of the Global Health Watch. We have a few copies here for inspection if you want to have a look. And we are going to be together until 7 o'clock. But I would really start breaking immediately the ice by asking Chiara a question in order to make people understand what's special about Global Health Watch. I mean, what makes this kind of publication different from other institutional reports? And I'm thinking especially about the mode of production of the report. What's behind the scene?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ivo. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks for those for following us from home. Just a bit of background why we believe this book is different from a report. It's because it comes from a long history of similar previous editions starting in 2006. And they are one of the key programs of an international movement that's called the People's Health Movement. It's an international network of activists around the right to health. It was born in 2000. You may know that at the Alma Ata conference, the World Health Organization in 1978 declared and envisioned a world where health would be a right and a reality for all in the year 2000. That was the projection, health for all in the year 2000. And so when the year 2000 came and health was not there for all and inequalities had widened and the governments were not delivering on their promises and international institutions were not delivering on their promises, that's where civil society got together and they decided that they needed to unite internationally in a network of international solidarity and political action. And that's how the People's Health Movement, was born. And significantly in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, so in a capital of the global South. Okay, so one of the characteristics of the People's Health Movement and of this book is that it brings critical and analytical perspectives from the global South. And this is something that you will rarely see in global health analysis, because as one of the chapters in here well describes, global health itself is a colonized area, is a colonized discipline. So anyway, back to the book, why they decided in those years, the World Health Organization would release a World Health Report. Okay, so it was a status of the world health. And the people in PHM decided that they want to bring people's voices about health and health struggles around the world. Okay, so these books from the beginning up to now are actually a collective effort of people in different countries, in different parts of the world, in many places in the global South, to tell their stories about what is not going on, not going well in health and in what we call the structural determinants of health. Because in many chapters in the previous and in this edition, you will find stories of what is not going well around health in different regions of the world, okay, and trying to analyze what are the common structural determinants. Okay, so what are the processes that enable, for example, market forces to extract profit from healthcare system, okay, in different parts of the world. And finally, just not to make it very long, but another feature that's embedded in these books is the idea of resistance and alternatives. So it's not just a book about a critical analysis, okay, theoretical critical analysis. It's an analysis that's built in the effort of activists to make a change, okay? So this is really important for us, that as we critically analyze the situation, we also try to strengthen and enforce paths for change, because activism is about making a difference, not just, a very bright analysis. So in this book and the previous ones, there is a lot of stories that we think are positive inspirations and also good examples for where, our efforts may fall.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Now, apart from the COVID period, the Global Health Watch came out roughly every 2 years. And clearly, the previous edition was coming out immediately after the COVID pandemic. It was not actually already over somehow. And clearly, that was quite the main topic around which several aspects were centered. What makes the 7th edition different from previous ones?
Okay.
You mentioned already, for instance, something related to global health as a colonial field. And clearly there is something, having read previous edition, there is something that makes quite different the kind of approach that was developed in this 7th edition.
Yeah, I think Ron will touch more upon some of the key aspects of the content, but what I can anticipate, still the effort of bringing in a decolonial perspective is an ongoing effort. Okay, it's like the effort to I don't know, to resist and transform patriarchy. It's never ending, because it goes again structures that are deeply embedded in our world. So when we did an evaluation of the previous edition of Global Health Watch, which was number 6, there was widespread appreciation for the book, but also some comments coming from the movement, okay, because the book is owned by the movement, okay, so that's who we are accountable to. And so many people in the movement still perceive that it was not reflecting enough the reality of many activists across the regions, and they came up with a series of recommendations, okay. They wanted the book to be more linked to movement building. Okay, so in this edition, for example, most chapters were collaborative efforts across regions, as I mentioned before. And it's really a challenge, and I think we were also open to debate maybe afterwards if it's worthwhile, because activists, and particularly in some areas of the world, they really don't have easy lives. Okay, so to sit down and write down their experience is not something that comes, very easily. So there was a lot of effort in supporting these collaborative groups and in trying to get what still needs to be quite rigorous. Okay, when we say that it's a collaborative activist effort, doesn't mean that it's like a story, that it has no scientific or rigorous value, because actually the facts need to be checked, the reference need to be there. So it's really a work of supporting this kind of knowledge surfacing, from the experience and becoming something that can be shared. And another feature that, without again spending too many words, but originally global, because the way in which you produce the book tells you also about the book itself, right? So traditionally, Global Health Watch was published by an independent publisher called Z Book, based in London, and then that book was merged into a large international publisher that was called Bloomsbury, with which we published last edition, Global Health Watch 6. And again, there was criticism in the movement, because when you go with a big publisher, you're not free to do what you want with your material. So we had to wait for the book to be published, which took almost 10 months before we could actually distribute the chapters. And we couldn't translate the chapters ourselves. So we had a lot of limitations in terms of copyright, which we didn't want to have. And so that's why we went, I'm not really bothering about the slide, sorry. We went with a solidarity publisher. It's called Daraja Press. It's based in Canada. And of course, it was much different. So we were free to, all the chapters are free for download. We were free to translate them in Spanish, which was a huge effort. So this, for the first time, the book is entirely available in Spanish, which is super relevant, because there are lots of contributions from Latin America and lots of very relevant contribution for public health coming from that continent. So so we were, basically we're free to do everything that we want with our book. And still, it's a book that can be found in libraries, can be ordered, and it has this status which was also important, because you can entirely self-publish, okay? But there is also a social and symbolic sort of status, that a publication reaches when it's published, it's listed, and so on and so forth. So we thought that this was important, because we saw that it does, make a difference in the circulation that the book has and lasting in years. So you can still find previous editions of Global Health Watch, which you wouldn't be able to if it was entirely self-published. I think that's it. I didn't really care about it. Yeah.
Two things, Chiara. First of all, if you can actually upgrade my position, because I'm not.
Oh, you're no longer. I'm sorry.
And if you can reduce the.
Reduce.
Colonna destra che
Oh, sure. Okay, hold on. Okay. Now you're a coordinator, and this will just put it down. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was very hot in my speech.
Let's go to actually the content of this 7th edition. What are, according to you, the main issues that you would signal out as characterizing this edition? And well, it's organized around several sections, and I don't want to spoil everything now, and I will mention them later, but really I would ask you, if you had to really brutally summarize, what are the main outcomes of this edition?
Ooh.
No, you can go with what we agreed, Ron.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Now, I can't see my,
Okay, these are the different.
I'm okay now. Is the camera in the right position?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good, okay. Okay, well, buonasera. And I've recently retired a few years ago from the University of Ottawa, but I came to public health because of an interest in social justice and social change and activism way back in the early 1970s. So I've been around a long time, doing all kinds of different things. And in the book, I've been involved with Global Health Watch ever since the first edition. And in fact, I had the opening chapter of that very first edition in 2006, which was based on a little book I'd written at that time because of the Health for All by the year 2000, and we missed that entirely, is I wrote a little book called Health for Some by the year 2000, and pointed out about all of the differences and the structural reasons for those differences. So we decided we would follow the same structure as we have in previous editions. It's a useful kind of way of outlining. So the global political and economic framework in which all of the other systems are conditioned, health systems, of course, because those are fundamentally important. All of the things that are beyond healthcare, the structural determinants of health, what we used to call social determinants, but we're now much better at understanding that we really have to talk about the socioeconomic structuration of health. Watching, what is going on with the World Health Organization, what's going on with the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, private philanthropies. So looking at global governance issues. And then, as Chiara said, resistant action and change. Now, in the previous edition of Global Health Watch 6, we also wanted very much to have narratives of struggle and change within each chapter. We still do that in this edition, but also kind of wanted to pull back and have one section that really focused on the struggles that people were going through, the challenges they were facing, and some of their successes, as well as some of their setbacks. Now, our last edition was, as Ivo pointed out, it was published in the shadow of the pandemic. And so that ran through all of the different chapters in that book. And this year, this new edition, we're releasing it under a different and a very ominous new shadow, and that is Donald Trump and the second presidency. So if you want to know what is a constant theme running all the way through this edition, it's beginning to analyze and assess what are the implications of this kind of incredibly well, my wife refers to him as a malingering narcissist, which is probably one of the most gentle ways to describe him. So this new Trump administration is very much driving a very chaotic disruption of the global economic order that we had up until January of this year. And it meant that why we subtitled this book as the Mobilizing for Health Justice was it really underscores the importance of not letting ourselves get kind of dumped down and overwhelmed by the toxicity of this new administration, and instead to continue to do the organizing work and the advocacy work that helps to sustain us. So what I would say is that you want to know what the major problem is or crisis that we're facing. There's a whole cluster of crises, socially, environmentally, economically, in terms of inequality, in terms of mass movements and migrations, xenophobia, all of this stuff. And we tend to bind them together under this new concept that academics like, called the polycrisis. Actually, it's really just a series of interlinked crises. But if we wanted to name the polycrisis, my two words, selection. Now, in 9 months, it was barely 32% of the eligible US voters who brought this monster into power again. And he has done more to threaten the health of people and planet than any of us might have imagined at the time when he was first reelected in November of last year. So his racism, his misogyny, they were already well known, but the speed with which he has morphed into an authoritarian dictator and transformed the world's wealthiest and most powerful country into a militarizing fascist state has really caught all of us off guard. We really weren't prepared for the speed and ferocity with which he would do this. Now, his threats to human health are actually fairly well known. His attacks on almost everything that global health activists have been struggling with for decades. So withdrawing from the WHO, and that plunges it into a fiscal crisis, but also using the US veto power at different international meetings to actually prevent consensus decision-making by the world's other nations. He did that very recently in terms of the Declaration on Non-Communicable Diseases. Denying climate change and actively preventing or defunding all of the possibilities of moving into a kind of a non-fossil fuel economy. Tax cuts to the wealthiest people in America, including all of his technology oligarchs. At the same time, defunding domestic and global health programs. And that's been estimated that rapid defunding in foreign assistance is thought now to lead to 14 million preventable deaths by the year 2030. We should actually call it out as premeditated mass murder, because in effect, that's what it is. We could talk about the Robert J. Kennedy Jr. and the anti-vax conspiracy theorists and all the others that he's appointed to head up the various health portfolios in the United States. That will actually leave us in much worse position should another pandemic arise, much worse than we experienced with the sudden arrival of COVID back in 2020. And then I'm Canadian, and some of you may be aware that Trump frequently talks about Canada as becoming the 51st state. And he's attempting to do that by instituting this massive tariff war where Canada, relative to our economic activity, we are suffering a greater loss due to the tariffs that Trump has imposed and his trade war than any other country in the world, including China. So this trade war, unfortunately, also in the past history of trade wars, tends to lead to military world wars. So we are quite concerned about what the potential global militarization might be. That's the good news. I want to draw attention to two other aspects of the new Trump presidency. The first is this whole anti-woke agenda. You're familiar with the term anti-woke around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, it's incredible to sort of have a whole political movement based upon saying equality. That's horrible. That's awful. We got to get rid of that. So it's enforcing an ideology that fundamentally, if you look at the Agenda 2025 that is driving the Trump presidency, it's white nativist, and it's as fiercely anti-intellectual as the infamous McCarthy trials were during the 1950s. So empathy and rationality is being replaced by viciousness and vindictiveness. And the rule of law is slowly, as many of us have probably seen by just following what's happening in mainstream media, the rule of law is slowly being replaced by a judicial coup d'etat in the United States. We are going to be living through some very interesting next 4 to 5 months. Now, the second one is the reliance on unbalanced and unchecked social media. And that's providing the information that builds most people's understanding of the world. And that's what I find most terrifying, because we're living in something called the big lie. And that's where there are attacks on any statement that happens to be contrary to the autocrat's ideology. They're belittled, and any statement issued by the autocrat is taken as absolute truth. Now, Hannah Arendt, who was a very influential European philosopher and who wrote a lot about what happened under Nazism in World War II, what she says is that the real power of the big lie is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything anymore. And that's what makes it possible for fascist dictators to retain their power. Now, Trump, though, he's not the only one embracing autocratic or authoritarian politics. One of the real challenges we're facing now is that 3/4 of the global population now lives under autocratic rule. And too often that's characterized by restrictions on free expression, independent media. There's partisan capture of the judiciary and the military. And there's an ideological assault on government workers, on universities and institutions that express values that are opposite to those of the autocrat. Civil society groups are shuttered, they're defunded, they're harassed, they're impugned, or actively and violently repressed. And some of that we document in Global Health Watch 7, as well as the strength of many of those who face those kinds of challenges in pushing back or trying to fight back and keeping strong. Now, many of these autocracies were actually voted initially into existence. And we can pose questions as to why so many people appeared at one time to want to vote for, the big daddy ruler, as it were. The best explanation, there's lots of theories, but the best explanation is that our past 40, 45 years of neoliberal capitalism created so much inequality and so much insecurity, especially amongst the high-income countries and the previously industrialized kind of working class, that faced with that kind of insecurity, if some strong man comes along, sometimes it's a strong woman, but usually it's a strong man, they will line up, especially when social media amplifies that kind of that anger and creates a sense of victimization. So a lot of Americans who voted for Trump were told that they were victims, and so they had to reassert their strength. And it's very convenient, of course, for the assert their strength against the weakest, which are the migrants. Now, the good news, I do want to leave you with some good news for a moment, is that historically, autocracies have been overturned. They've been kind of counter-revolutionized. They've been unelected or thrown out of power. So that has happened and can happen again. But the kicker for those of us in the room is that can we have this pendulum swing from this far-right extreme autocracy to something more kind of participatory and democratic and more equitable before our climate change clock ticks into kind of unstoppable change when we begin to sort of lose the resources of our planet. So now a few years ago, I wrote this book, which is a swan song. Are you familiar with the idea of a swan song as sort of the last thing you want to do? And I knew that I was coming to the end of my active academic research period, and I wanted to consolidate all of that work into this one book. And in the final chapter in this book, we argue that neoliberal global dominance had given rise to multiple interrelated crises. So this stuff we now call the polycrisis. And the three major ones are we had these massively rising inequalities, this ecological collapse, and this huge migration or movement of people, the displacement within borders, but also the attempt to go beyond borders, usually to escape the inequalities or to deal with the fact of the droughts or all the climatic changes that were happening where they lived. Unfortunately, since publishing that book, things have gotten much worse. And I want to give a brief reminder of what those forces of the last 45 years that drove those inequalities, created that massive climate change, led to all of this mass movement of people and the consequent kind of xenophobia and antagonisms that have arisen. And that's neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is best defined by its leading architect as Friedrich von Hayek. He was very concerned in the afterglow of World War II of rising communism, of socialism, even of social democracy. And so he took classical liberal economic theory and put it on steroids. And so fundamentally challenged and expanded on what liberal capitalism was supposed to do. So that became neoliberalism. And his argument was that Only free markets, sovereign individuals, free trade, strong property rights, and minimal government. That's the only recipe to enhance human well-being. You can sort of see that this is very much the characteristics by which we've been living for the last 45 or 50 years. And neoliberalism has gone through 3 phases since it first gained a foothold back in the 1980s. So you saw the election of conservative governments in the United States under Reagan, and in the UK under Thatcher, in Germany under Helmut Kohl. And those conservative regimes basically bought into the neoliberal playbook. And the resulting oil price cartels, the huge oil price shocks of the 1970s, the huge amount of money flowing through that system, and the need of many developing countries to purchase fossil fuels for their own, the former colonies, now that they're decolonizing and had their own governments, that led to this massive debt burden. And that it became impossible for these countries. Mexico was the first, but almost all of the other developing countries followed suit. They could not service their debts to the banks in high-income countries that were pushing all of these loans into these nations. So when the debt crisis occurred, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund moved in and they adopted neoliberal policy requirements as conditions for countries to get bailed out. That was structural adjustment programs. That was the first rollout of neoliberalism. By the early 1990s, and the US was the leader on this one, they began to deregulate financial markets and open up all global financial markets. And so you had this phenomenon called financialization, where those private equity firms, hedge funds, investment banks, where those who controlled financing became able to dictate what all of the policies would be, whether they were public policies or private policies. I'll touch on that a little bit later when we talk about the health system privatization chapter. And the third one, of course, is that all of this financialization in the second wave is what led to the 2008 global financial crisis and the near collapse of capitalism. Governments raced in to bail out these greedy banks, and as a consequence, they ran up more debt. And as a consequence, the greedy banks that they bailed out said, austerity. Now you got to cut back. Everybody had to tighten their belts. Do you remember austerity? I'm sure you had that here in Italy. Everybody had to tighten their belts and do less with less, except the very people who were responsible for creating the crisis in the first place. Okay, enough of neoliberalism. Now, one thing that we might thank Donald Trump for is that he has put the final nail into the coffin of global neoliberal capitalism as the organizing international economic order. We have no idea what that new order is going to look like, but it's no longer going to be the same kind of neoliberal mantra. It's going to be something different. Market fundamentalism might remain. Some of the inequalities that rest within the neoliberal model might still be there as they exist within individual countries. But as an organizing principle for the global economy, it's gone. And thank heavens, it should have left a long time ago. But now, what are we left with? So there's no agreement on what to call this new illiberal order that Trump is bringing into existence. Some call it oligarchic capitalism. So you think about the oligarchs, whether they're technology oligarchs or they're fossil fuel oligarchs or they're financial oligarchs, but the very, very wealthy who run these massive corporations. Some call it techno-feudalism. That's Yanis Varoufakis, who was the kind of former finance minister during Greece's horrible times and is a prolific critic and writer of alternative ways of understanding economy these days. And in techno-feudalism, it's the big tech companies. They control now the digital commons. and that includes artificial intelligence, that includes all of our technology, all of that stuff that is pushing in a certain direction. And they exact rents from us. So every time that we access this digital platform that runs our economy now, they extract capital from us. And part of that capital, of course, is our own personal information, which then becomes a marketable item that makes them that much wealthier. But I think that the easiest way to understand this new order is the one here that's in the case of Trump is mafia capitalism. It's got a nice ring to it, with the president playing the role of the Godfather. Now, how do we confront this political pathology? And there are streams of this kind of analysis that weave through the various chapters of Global Health Watch 7. So just like in Global Health Watch 6, we had to very quickly kind of rewrite or revise some of the chapters as they were being produced because of the pandemic. We had to do the same with Global Health Watch 7 to try to take into account some of the speed and viciousness of these transformations that the Trump presidency is bringing about. But it speaks to a fundamental dilemma in capitalism. By whatever reform or whatever name we try to call it, and that is that it relies upon continuous growth. And this growth, in turn, is premised on this consumption imperative. And that's kind of really well captured in this particular little illustration and a quote from a market individual in the 1950s. Now, I grew up in the 1950s, and all of a sudden, we were just, there was everything. You know, all of a sudden, we had all kinds of new stuff, new chemicals, new furniture, new items, all kinds of stuff. And what this marketing guru was saying is that in order to keep this going, this stuff has to be made in a way that it dies very quickly, it falls apart very quickly, because we have to keep reinventing and recreating commodities over and over again. And that pretty much typified the 1950s up until now. So with every crisis capitalism is faced with the past century, the government response has been to prime this growth imperative, to keep priming, more and more growth. You've probably heard that in Italy. You can't find a single government where they haven't talked about the need for growth. But of course, if we keep on that bandwagon, we're destroying the very basis of our future livelihoods. And so the first section of Global Health Watch 7, we also return to two other growth terms that were first discussed in Global Health Watch 6. And that's the degrowth and the post-growth concept. Now, both of these terms emphasize the importance of a deliberate and regulated reduction in excess consumption in high-emitting sectors and countries, and especially by the wealthy, the 0.001% of us, and a redirection of investment instead into the goods and services necessary for improving the health and protecting the planet in lower and middle income countries and for all of us. And there's also some signs of positive change. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, last year, he commissioned a group of global economists to develop a single comparative set of well-being economy measures. So this new concept of a well-being economy. And that would go way beyond the GDP, the gross domestic product that governments rely upon. And that's built upon this cycle of continuous consumption and destruction. And if these kind of set of well-being economy indicators were adopted, it could require countries to report to the UN General Assembly annually what their status is in terms of actually assuring that we have a well-being economy and not a growth consumptive economy. Kent, reference is also made to Kate Rawor's influential donut economics model, or have you come across this in the past? The donut economics. It's this lovely way of basically saying that you have all kinds of social disintegration things that are affecting health on the inside and all kinds of environmental overshoot on the outside that's imperiling health. And what we need to do is we need to be in that little green zone, that little safe green zone where we're just consuming enough to be healthy, and we're redistributive and protective enough in our social structures that people can continue to be healthy. Now, at the same time, this degrowth and post-growth economics have been criticized for their ability to mobilize the masses because they're seen as too negative, especially in many societies and for many people. Growth is not a bad term. Growth is a good term. We love to see our children grow. We love to see our plants grow. We love to see our relationships grow. So this led to introducing a different term that's more positive, this concept of a well-being economy. And in simple terms, it really means one that pursues an equitable global allocation of the resources people need to be healthy while staying within the boundaries of planetary environments. Now, the concept was also part of People's Health Movement, their People's Health Assembly 5, which was held last November in Argentina, because it emphasized the struggle for buen vivir, the South American concept of living well, and the embrace of traditional health knowledge. And that forms a part of two of the lead chapters in Global Health Watch 7, is how that embrace kind of was kind of it's very affirming. And we're at a time right now where we have to continue to hold on to all of those positive affirmations. The WHO also got a bit intrigued with this idea of the well-being economy, and it had a special council on the economics of health for all that was comprised of the world's, all women, comprised of the world's leading feminists and heterodox economists. So they produced a whole series of reports. Some of them are kind of a little more reformist. Some of them are a little bit more radical in their recommendations. But they're, again, trying to push for this idea that we need to reconceive our understanding of economy. And that's very consistent with this idea of a well-being economy. And a year later, this collaboration of the Club of Rome and a whole bunch of other organizations, and the Club of Rome became quite famous in the 1970s for producing a book called The Limits to Growth. It was one of the first kind of economic modeling that said we can't continue to grow our way out of our problems. We have to find a different way of understanding and relating about the things that we need, the things that we produce, the things that we consume. So in this report, they actually had 17 very specific policy directives. And they point out with a lot of, again, extensive modeling, that if we actually abided by those particular policy recommendations, which were pretty straightforward, that by the year 2100, we face a good chance of still being around and reasonably healthy on a planet that still had life. But if we didn't do that by the year 2100, we'd probably have fallen apart and had kind of chaotic, non-kind of sustainable planetary conditions. Now, two recent reviews also kind of tried to take a look at all of these new ideas around well-being economy and see which one worked best. I'm very partial, as is many of the members of People's Health Movement, to something called a critical eco-socialist model of a well-being economy, so that it synthesizes the basic tenets or rules of ecology alongside the Marxist critique of political economy. And so then it advocates for policies that are founded on non-monetary criteria. So we found them based on social needs, on individual well-being, on this ecological equilibrium. And strategically, it calls for the creation and support of localized forms of non-commodified systems. So we can't get away from the fact, even at this global scale of so essential for transformation of our economic order, we can't get away from the fact that we need to build it from the ground up. So it's in those localized examples of cooperatives, environmental sustainability projects. These initiatives prefigure what a transformed global economy might look like, whether it's achieved by revolution, evolution, or necessity. And reports like those of the World Health Organization and the Club of Rome and the Earth for All, they actually provide a lot of very useful policy tools for groups that are trying to organize or mobilize for these sorts of transformations from the ground level up. Now, we ended the first section of this book with a little quote from Antonio Gramsci, because it's pretty hard when you spent a long time sort of looking at how horrible this abyss is, especially now that, you know, Trump is where he is. So we go back to that period in the 1930s during the when Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks. And that was another period where there was a lot of mass confusion, a lot of mass chaos. And he wrote about how the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And that's sort of a bit like the time we find ourselves in now. He said it's an interregnum. There's a great variety of morbid symptoms that appear. That's a bit of a complicated translation. Other people have simplified it and they said it's a time of monsters. So we're living in a time of monsters. But of course, he was also very much committed to activism. So he talked about he was a pessimist because of intelligence, but he was an optimist because of will. And I kind of tend to think of optimism actually more as a very carefully studied and practiced act of political opposition. So optimism is an act of political opposition. It's something that we have to keep nurturing amongst ourselves. Now, I want to go back and just highlight a few of the sections here as well in the book, other sections, because I've dealt a lot now about what the big, horrible macro picture is. What does it look like in some of the more kind of specific areas? So the second section of the book, we looked about health systems, we looked at privatization, financialization, corporatization, we looked at public health alternatives. And we also went and dealt a little bit with artificial intelligence in health systems. So we looked about equitable health systems from an intersectional gender perspective. Introduced an idea called abolition medicine, which is quite intriguing in the chapter because it looks about how the organization of health systems too often parallels the organization of police systems. And there's a kind of a collusion between the two. A very interesting concept. And of course, we had a chapter that would look at the whole decolonization issue. So on the health system, the chapter that we had was on privatization and financialization of health systems. It starts with a question about why do public systems still struggle while private health continues to thrive? And it offers three basic reasons for that: privatization, financialization, and corporatization. So those are the three driving forces for this. Now, just as a way of putting this in context, there's been a lot of progress in terms of trying to have some degree of improved access to healthcare or in various different countries, but we're not doing terribly well. I mean, OOP, that's short for out-of-pocket spending, is what people have to pay to get access health services. Now in Italy, I was surprised to find out it's still 23%, and it's been going up in the last couple of years. In Canada, it's also going up, but it's only at 15%. In low-income countries, it's 45% and still going up. In the middle-income countries, it's 35%, but across the average of all the wealthiest countries, it's 13%, but it's still going up. So people are still spending a lot of what they need to live on to access healthcare. One of the concerns is this healthcare privatization. And there are many ways in which this privatization occurs. One of them, of course, is this user fees or co-payments, whether it's for a public healthcare or for private healthcare, the out-of-pocket component. Private provision, that is either wholly or only partially publicly financed, and that's the case in most of the high-income countries. They have a mixed public-private system. I think that's the case pretty much here in Italy. You can have private financing, which builds and operates its own private health system. Then you have private health insurance, which is financialized. This is the way in which financialization begins to enter. One of the other and more recent ones is this idea of social impact bonds. This is becoming, in terms of trying to fill the gap in official development assistance or foreign aid is to look at encouraging private investors to purchase bonds that the money of which is going to be used for something socially useful. Now, that's good. But really what they're after, I mean, first of all, who has the money to invest in these social impact bonds? It's the wealthy. And what do they actually expect, apart from feeling that they're doing good by putting some money that's going to be useful in some way? They expect a return on investment. They want profits. Even if some of the socially useful outcomes are created, and in many cases they're not, and not created very well. And underlying this question is that, why do we want to have private investors financing socially useful projects? Isn't that what governments are supposed to do? And that begs the question of, why aren't governments providing the financing for these things which are essential? Now, I'll get to that one in just a moment. I'm going to talk a bit about taxation. But financialization, that's simply just moving ahead quickly on that. Financialization is essentially that where all of these private financial actors, the banks, the hedge funds, the private equity, and we're living through an era now where more and more of finance capital is moving into private equity funds, which are unregulated. Basically, they move in, they buy up public assets, or even sometimes private assets. They strip whatever capital and wealth they can out of those, and then they give them back to the government. That's what France did, right? So they purchased all these buildings from public and private healthcare facilities, and then they charged them really high rents, and they earned a whole bunch of money doing that. And then when these privatized services began to collapse, they went back to the government and said, government, you can have them back now. So that's how financialization works, to kind of like basically extract capital and profit out of public facilities. Then corporatization, that's really about kind of restructuring healthcare systems along corporate lines. So one of the ways in which you could look at that, and I know this is the case more from universities' experience, but it's also the case with hospitals or other healthcare facilities, is that I can look at what the rectors or presidents of universities now are getting paid in Canada, the United States, and Australia. They're getting paid $1 to $2 million a year. They're getting paid salaries like chief executive officers. That's the corporatization. It takes the model of huge private corporate actors and puts it into these public institutions. So another aspect. Now, I just want to point out here a few pictures or some images from Global Health Watch 7, because we also talk about the many instances where health workers have really been pushing back, where they've been going on strike. They've been using courts and arguing around their health human rights. So they are pushing back. It's very hard because, you know, this huge boulder called kind of global capitalism, that huge border, right? Boulder is very, very hard to sort of roll back, but they are making efforts to do so. So there's been a lot and there have been some changes. Kenya's actually got some significant improvements in some of its health systems because of the activism of Kenyan health workers. National Health Services, right? Big demonstrations how privatization kills. But that then brings me back to this problem of capitalism itself. And the pivotal importance in all the years that PHM has been in existence, in all the years that health activists generally and other social justice activists over time have been struggling, is that capitalism itself is a disequalizing system. It relies upon inequality. And the only two ways in which those inequalities can be adjusted into a little bit more fairness is something called pre-market income inequalities, and that's through equitable distribution between capital and labor. So those who produce earn much more than those who actually invest. Well, we've seen that in the last 45 years, tip perilously in the wrong direction. The other way is through income inequalities, through taxation. through transfers, through university accessible public services, subsidized essential services. So that's the post-market intervention by the state, by governments through taxation to try to equalize things a bit better. We haven't done very well on that either. So we have a chapter that deals with this on tax justice. And again, to repeat a little bit about Kira said about what we tried to do differently with this version is we tried to really extend the reach and the breadth of the people and the actors who were involved in producing it. So we had this chapter was produced by the Tax Justice Network. And I don't know if you're familiar, but the Tax Justice Network, it has its own little chapters in almost every country. It exists at a global stage, and it focuses entirely on this issue of tax justice. And in the chapter, it's just a very simple little graph that shows you how certain forms of taxation at different levels in our political economy transfers over to different kinds of benefits in terms of our social organization. It also points out how governments over the last half century of neoliberal dominance surrendered much of what they call these tax superpowers. Now, so this graph, I think, goes a long way to showing why governments are into promoting social impact bonds, why they're trying to get private investors to sort of go merge into these public-private partnerships, why even the UN itself and even the WHO is trying to get private money to come in to support their public work. That's because we've given away our abilities to tax. We surrendered those under neoliberalism. So back in 2002, that was the first year that they had data available that one could calculate what the actual monetized value is of what is captured by tax and what is left in private hands. And in 2002, it was about $30 trillion, untaxed global income. And in 2019, that had risen to $75 trillion. And the last time I checked in 2022, it's $91 trillion. It's like just think of if we actually had reasonable tax measures, how much we could do in terms of green energy, ending of fossil fuels, completely wiping out poverty, developing countries, low and middle income countries in a decent, equitable, justifiable, non-misogynist, non-sexist, non-patriarchal, non-racist way. There's a whole lot that we could do with that. So again, a positive note, there is some momentum on this. So in 2023, again, Antonio Guterres, he initiated, and a year later, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to create a negotiation for a global tax convention. This would go beyond just this idea of 15% minimal tax for corporations. This is going to be a much bigger tax convention that would really look at a global scale of redistribution. I'm ashamed to say that there were the world's wealthiest countries, the G8 countries, they all voted against it, including my own country of Canada. So that's why we call it a G8 of shame. Now, the proposed tax priorities that are now being negotiated, so they're in negotiation right now. The three that they're looking at: digital economy, illicit financial flows, that's when the wealthy corporations and individuals basically strip all of the wealth out of low and middle income countries, and high net worth individuals, basically the oligarchs. That would raise about $1.4 trillion a year, and that almost all of it would go to low and middle income countries. So we have this enormous possibility to harvest a lot of the wealth that gets created in reasonably amoral and not very pleasant ways. But that could begin to be a corrective to the sorts of pathological kind of economic, political economy that we currently reside within, that we still have to put up with. Now, then there's the most pressing existential health crisis, and that's climate and ecosystem collapse. And one of our really inspiring chapters of resistance actually discusses the efforts of citizens groups. So students, youth groups, older adults, seniors, women's in Switzerland, environmental justice groups, they're trying to use the courts, this kind of strategic legislative action, to try to hold fossil fuels to account. One of them was in Switzerland, where a group of elder women took their country to court for its failure to protect the environment and stop climate change. And they argued that it violated the fundamental human rights. And in April 2024, the European Court of Justice agreed with them. And so, you know, Switzerland has to do something now. What it's going to do, we're not sure, but they've been told that they have to do something. In 2021, Friends of the Earth in Netherlands, on behalf of 6 other organizations and some 17,000 individuals, they won a court verdict requiring Shell to reduce its carbon dioxide of global emissions by 45% by 2030. And in 2020, 9 Ecuadorian girls lodged a constitutional injunction against their government for allowing glass flaring, which is the open air pipes when they're trying to extract natural gas, and that it damaged their environment, water health, biodiversity loss, and climate change. And in 2021, they won, and gas flaring is supposed to be eliminated by 2030. And maybe perhaps one of the biggest ones is in July of this year, where the International Court of Justice ruled that states must act to present foreseeable climate harm or face international legal responsibility. Now, this is a ruling that's non-binding, and especially when you consider that some of the worst culprit countries do not recognize the status of the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. But around the world, there are poor communities, these students, these older people, environmental organizations. They've been using the courts to have these strategic legal interventions in efforts to pay for or overcome and stop the environmental damages of fossil fuels and extractive capitalism. Now, this strategic use, though, is not always successful, and big oil in particular has pushed back very vigorously. Friends of Earth Netherlands eventually had their victory overturned by a higher court, not because the higher court disagreed, but it said, we can't just penalize Shell because all the other fossil fuel countries are doing it as well, all the other fossil fuel companies. So Friends of the Earth wants to try and launch another court case that would take that into account, so it wouldn't be overturned by that particular kind of a ruling. Meanwhile, Shell and Exxon are now trying to sue the Netherlands government because it closed down the Groningen gas field. And that was because there were all of these earth tremors that were happening because of the fracking of the natural gas. And they're trying to use these horrible investor-state dispute settlement rules of international investment treaties. They're going to sue the Netherlands government. That's what they're going to try and do. So we have a real challenge. It's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of our ability to use the courts, but it is a tool that exists. And there are groups and movements that continue to push forward in trying to use legislation as one of the means by which we could hold these countries, these companies in these countries to account. I wouldn't place my bets on the US being one of those countries that we'd be able to hold to account at this particular time, but there are groups in the US still trying to do that. Now, eco-just lawfare continues, despite Trump's efforts. Green energy globally, so a bit more just to think about a bit of good news again, is that green energy globally is still far outpacing fossil fuels in terms of new development initiatives. So the green energy transformation looks like it's going to be unstoppable. And which country is leading in doing that? China. China is so far ahead in terms of trying to transition its whole domestic economy into non-fossil fuel green energy. That's why one of the reasons why Trump in his second presidency is so angry with China is because China's going to win on that one. Now, finally, we have to talk a little bit, and we have a chapter that deals with war, conflict, and displacement. And although World War II is still the single largest conflict in terms of the number of people who were killed or injured as a consequence of that war. But now regional conflict has increased dramatically. And the death toll from these regional conflicts is rapidly rising. There were over 237,000 conflict-related deaths in 2022, the last time they were tabulated. And that's the highest number seen over the past 30 years. Here's just some of the figures that we've had to deal with in terms of some of the conflicts-related mortality in our chapter. So in the figures coming out of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, massive. Sudan, which is the one that we tend to hear the least about in most media, is in some ways the largest and most critical. But then there's Gaza and what's happened with the Palestinians. I think all of us are quite aware of the absolute horrors of what occurred, the crimes against humanity, the genocide that was perpetrated, and kind of wonder how or why a group that was victimized in a Holocaust should within 2 or 3 generations become the perpetrators of a Holocaust. Not a good bit of good news to sort of end this presentation on. We know that some of the things that have happened in Gaza, PHM, so People's Health Movement, has been very supportive of working with the Palestinian health authorities for many years, and been trying to sort of support some of the reconstruction now and ongoing work with the health systems in Gaza. It's a relief that there is a ceasefire. Do those of us in People's Health Movement think that we're going to have lasting peace in Israel? Unlikely, very unlikely. Not until the extreme right wing and Netanyahu are rejected by their own people. And finally, we dedicated Global Health Watch 7 to the Palestinians and to all the people worldwide who are struggling to end the genocide in Gaza, often facing their own persecutions within their own countries because of standing up for Palestinians and being seen in some way as being anti-Semitic or being hostile to what the particular position was of the autocrats in power at that time. So we dedicated that to them and point out how collective action is still the most powerful medicine against ill health and health inequality. There's Global Health Watch 7 in a nutshell. Now you don't have to read the book. No, actually, you do want to read the book. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know whether we want to open the floor now.
Yeah.
Or otherwise I got one last. But since you just closed on collective action as the most powerful medicine, and given the observatory provided by GHW7, that it's present in over 80 countries, and it's made up of NGOs, of social groups, of very diverse social collectives. Within the context you have been just reconstructing, what's the health status of social movements within the field of health justice from the observatory of the People Health Movement?
Do you want to take that one, Chiara?
Well, I can.
Well, bear it in mind if you want, and we open the floor.
And then we open the floor as well for people to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't we open the floor and we keep this question
Yeah.
because it may,
May
So
trigger other other points.
yeah.
Up to you.
And feel free to ask a question in English o in italiano, potete anche, se non vi sentite comodi o comode con l'inglese, e poi noi la traduciamo per Ivo e per
Ron.
per Ivo anche.
Dico in italiano.
And it doesn't have to be a question. It could just be a comment. something that you'd like to say about kind of the state of the world's global health at this time.
If people at home are also free to intervene if they want. Don't be shy. It's a good chance because it's not, I was telling Ron, go slowly and don't, maybe I was wrong, but I don't feel like these kind of, global political analysis is very shared. It's very common to have this, connecting the local, the global. And then he's really, he's really good in doing that. So you should take your chance. And,
She likes me.
yeah, I like him, of course.
I'm going for it. I really don't have like your question, but I'm gonna take it. So like we saw a lot of graph and a lot of regarding the history and regarding the also inequalities in different countries in different parts of the world and across the time, more or less. And I wonder if so maybe two questions. The first one, if has ever been done a research regarding the impact of every single aspect into the health of individuals, and so how much does the environment influence health in one specific region, and also the differences between the region, or how much is the war impact health in a single region. And the second part of the question regards if, regarding us in the West or in the Western part of the world, we feel like, even though, I don't know, I think most of the time also, our media try to put out the idea that we are actually improving, even though, we are actually growing, as you said before, even though there is war, in other parts of the world, even though we see every year an increasing number of environmental catastrophes, even though there is war just 1,000 kilometers away from here, there's this feeling that, yeah, but we are doing, poverty is going down, and etc. And these, I think, during the last years, both from a biological and also, I think, from a health, mental, so both the biological and the mental aspect, and also the social aspect of our lives in the West is being deteriorating. And I think the concept that we are just seeing now the first consequences, but I think it's something that we'll see more in the future. I wonder what's your take on those two things. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Yeah. Maybe we could
Okay.
if there is anybody else.
I need my question. Just, I've been wondering, thank you for your presentation. Like our generations, and we are all very young, mid-20s more or less. So I think we are all facing the same problem, which is how to manage to stay hopeful and positive while the variabili, how do you say, all there are so many things going on. No? So the word, it's very hard to simplify them, no? Because everything is so connected. So I try and ask people older than me if they have any advice in how to keep how to keep myself grounded and stay hopeful at the same time, but also very aware of what is happening and continue to hope for something better while criticizing at the same time. So, sometimes it's so hard to synthesize everything, to summarize everything, and to stay hopeful. Sorry, I repeat the same thing like 10 times. I'm very tired.
You've just summarized the last 60 years of my life, but I'm still optimistic.
Question about the alternatives that you were mentioning at the beginning of your speech. And I was curious about, like, you were talking about the decolonizing approach in all your work. And I was wondering, how do you select alternatives? How do you think that the alternative that you, I think, included in this book are decolonized or in this decolonizing process, and how they can be collective attitude to the experiential aspect, to the social aspect of people's life, and sorry, and can be part of this process, because of course I agree on the critic part, but I was wondering which alternative did you include and how did you select those alternatives? Because we were not have time to talk about it.
Thank you.
You mentioned like a new era is starting with Trump's election. So I was wondering, what's the best posture now, the best tactical way to lead the next few years or the next phase, let's say, even to what are the best things to work on, even to prevent that we go back from this new neo-nationalist phase to the classic global neoliberal phase, because that's, I think, an important thing, not to just go back to say it was better before, because now we're starting worse period with the neo-nationalist ideas. So what's the best thing to work on to prevent us going back?
That's easy. That's for you. Okay. Shall we maybe try to?
Yes.
Yeah. So I will start.
Yeah.
I will touch upon different things that people have mentioned in terms of health of the movements, how to stay hopeful, how to deal with the rhetoric that we're ever improving while we're experiencing deteriorating material and mental conditions, and the alternatives. So I will try to cut across all this. Maybe starting from, the mass demonstrations that I think many of us were involved in the past month or so, here and across the world, showing that movements, are still alive and they can make a difference, definitely, in many different ways, because they change the experience personally. I was in tens of demonstrations, against the genocide. But when it becomes massive, when you feel, the power of the people, that you can block a city, that you can block a country, then your experience changes around this. And we had, accounts from Gaza, people watching what was happening here and gathering strength. So this idea of international solidarity is not an empty lemma. It's not an idea, it's a practice. And when you practice and when you experience it, then it becomes transformative, okay? Not just for your self-experience, but also for the other world. And I think that, and that's also, how the alternatives are selected. They're not selected, they're practiced, and once they are practiced, so some we know a very good experience, and then the network is active in all the continents. So you would just go at times, from you contact somebody in a region and say, okay, so we are looking for like cases of litigation against fossil fuels that are rooted in social movements, and then through that you get another content, and of course you have to face barriers in this. Language is still a powerful barrier as to how to reach to people's experience, and I don't think we succeeded in all cases, but including with the decolonial perspective, the movement any movement, and PHM is no different, is very diverse. It includes patriarchy, it includes domination of colonial concepts. It reproduces, I mean, and subverts all the structural drivers of inequality. So it's the matter of how you address these. And just to end on something that we didn't touch upon very much, but I think it's closely related also to the idea of, are we improving? Is that this very idea of being on a linear time scale that goes, you know, from one point to another, from an origin to a destination, and it's moving in this direction, and it's meant to improve. You know, I think it's very problematic. It's very counterintuitive when you see how our world works, how nature works, how we work as bodies, as living beings. You know, so the idea of cycles, the idea of reproduction, this is very much connected to life. So life is a cycle, okay, and life is its end. It incorporates death. I mean, so this, I think there is a very flawed and problematic, but very rooted way of conceiving the world, okay, that's very Western, that's very masculine, that's very colonial, okay. So in this book you will find at least 2 chapters that really directly defy this idea, but not defy it, but provide a different space for understanding what a struggle for health may look like in a way that is informed by this, okay. So again, Latin American autochthonous indigenous peoples and thinkers and public health scholars have worked a lot with this idea of the collective, with this idea of buen vivir, so of living well. And there's a lot in the book, and there's a lot in the movement that speaks about this. So when we think about alternatives, I really personally, I think we need to go back to that kind of conception, which, and I will end for real, also helps you to stay rooted, because that's maybe, it may seem like a contradiction for a global movement, but actually it's rooted in your local. I mean, so if you want, for me, the sense of being part of the PHM is building here, you know, including a community, including spaces where we can nurture, you know, one another. We can share. We can, in a way, create a space for practicing those changes that we also advocate and we try to push at a collective scale. I'm done.
Well, that's basically kind of, I think, addresses your point, which is, you know, how do you stay sane? How do you stay grounded when you look at how overwhelming everything is? Well, I would suggest that maybe from time to time you don't look at how everything. I mean, that's been my way of being grounded, was to have to look at everything and then produce this kind of stuff. But in terms of activism, I think that you want to find a particular struggle, a particular issue around the kind of larger sort of way in which you think the world should be, and you attach some time and energy to that struggle. You don't have to tackle all the struggles all at once. You know, that's what the book does. So you don't have to care about that. Let the book take care of that. But the other, I think, is that it goes to what Chiara was talking about in terms of it at local scales. Is that modeling locally what we do with each other in terms of the kind of caring that we really make a lot of effort at doing, the kind of sharing that we do, the non-commodified types of exchanges we engage with each other. If we don't have those models in place, if and when an opportunity arises for those to become more, shall we say, I don't like the term, but it's used a lot in, you know, colonizing global health, but when it gets scaled up, and it's something that happens more at local, regional, or even national levels, we need to have those models that are already existing and healthy and working at local scales. And they are. I mean, there's a lot of cooperatives that exist. There's a lot of exchange systems that exist outside of financialized capitalism. And more people are sort of engaging in those kinds of things, as much out of a sense of survival as anything else. And if we look at the way in which most people actually exhibit a lot of care and concern and generosity in their relationships with other people. So it's kind of like having to remember or remind ourselves that despite the fact that we have all these monsters in our midst, most of humanity is not monstrous. Most of humanity is actually quite caring and quite loving. And we need to continue to embrace that amongst ourselves, because that is where I think you get the soul of optimism. Oh, you had a question about what's going to happen. Are we going to go back to a kind of a global neoliberal order? And I think not. I think that if we manage to avoid a world war of some type, if we able to kind of restrict the kind of regional conflicts that are occurring, what I think we're probably going to find is a kind of quadratic partitioning of economic or global order. So you're going to have, kind of the so-called spheres of influence. So you'll have a kind of a Western hemisphere with the US still dominant. Although hopefully through things like the BRICS Plus group of countries will begin to diversify some of that into the upper middle income countries, because they're exhibiting more power or authority now in terms of their capacity to intervene at global scales. You'd have, the South Asian and kind of China sort of pivoting here with China and India basically becoming fairly powerful in terms of this particular part of the world. You would have then, alas, Russia would still continue to exert influence simply because at the present time with its interventions in Ukraine. And if the EU could ever kind of get its act together, the EU economically is larger than the United States, right? The EU collectively, its economy is bigger than the US. And I'm sure that if it assembled all of its armed forces together, it would certainly be put up a good fight against the US if military strength mattered. So it's what I see is that if in terms of this emergent possible global order, is we'll begin to see regionalized struggles going on in terms of politics and economy, less so at a global scale. So there's some transformations that can happen through the Americas, some transformations that can happen through Europe, some transformations that can happen through South and Southeast Asia. That's, I think, the direction we're going to head into.
No, I have a question. I have a follow-up question. Wait, are
Mhm.
you done with?
Yeah.
No, I mean, so if this is the scenario, because PHM puts a lot of effort in endorsing or trying to strengthen some multilateral institutions. So still believing that multilateral institutions can be a space for, mitigating the damages, or so is this gonna still be the case in the kind of world that you are describing?
I think it will be, because I think not, if we can avoid a kind of an imposition, as it were, a transformation into a total set of autocratic regimes, but if we can still have some participatory democracy playing out in some of the low income and upper middle income countries, they will kind of continue to work multilaterally. And in fact, I think that in some respects, Trump has done us a bit of a favor by abandoning global governance. It's created a vacuum, because we still need to have global agreements. We still need to have international rules. We'll still need to have norms and laws that exist within countries and across countries. So we'll still need that. And that is the work of multilateral institutions. And Trump, by vacating that, has actually created opportunities if some of the low and middle income countries, which they are actually stepping in. If I look at the UN, I mentioned, you know, you had the Global Tax Convention. You had the interventions at the International Court of Justice. Who brought those? Low-income countries brought those. Wasn't high-income countries. It was the ones coming in and saying, "Oh, the U.S. they're done." So we're going to go in and push these things because there's a space for us to do that now. Is that going to make them the dominant kind of feature of governance across all countries? No, probably not. There's still going to be power struggles, but it creates a more powerful set of voices and a broader set of voices than just what we hear coming out of the kind of the richest countries of the world.
Thank you.
Do you think democracy is the appropriate and maybe functional tools for promoting justice and equity? Just
Promoting
justice and
oh,
equity.
justice and equity. I'll just repeat. I'll repeat a little bit I said just a moment ago, which is that I think, like, I go back to one, like, you know, because I was in my 20s too once, and you know, I got arrested once. You know,
I didn't know
I got fired once. I got criminally investigated by the secret police in Canada. They do have secret police once. So I had my kind of adventures on the margins. What I've learned is that and it's kind of the advice I used to give frequently to kind of other groups, is that don't try to do everything all at once. It makes for a good movie. Did you ever see that movie, Everything All at Once? That's a silly movie. So no, don't try to do everything all at once. In terms of look at locally, what are the kinds of politics? What are the kinds of alternatives? What are the kinds of cooperatives, the other sort of systems outside of kind of financialized capitalism that you can participate in? What issue of injustice, kind of we'll go back to social justice, what issue of injustice hits you hardest, that you feel most upset about? Then work with groups that are tackling that particular issue. Be aware of all of the connections to the poly crisis. So, you know, keep your head open to how they're all interconnected and intertwined, but spend your energy where on that issue that you feel most passionately about. And then again, the old thing about, you know, always take care of yourselves.
I think you missed the first part of your question was about democracy, whether
Yeah.
democracy can still be a system to promote or defend justice.
Liberal democracy, no. Kind of the liberal democracy is based upon market power, right? And that it goes back to liberal capitalism. Participatory democracy, yes, because participatory democracy was always a part of socialist thinking. You know, Piketty in France talks about that. He talks about a kind of a participatory socialism. So it is. It's not democratic in the sense of we rely on voting. What we you know, that might be part of it, because sometimes we have to make kind of plural decisions. But it relies upon kind of the participatory understanding of people, which is why, again, I go back to my concern is about the way in which we have the big lie, the way in which we have social media, in which we're distorting anything about reflection, whether we look at empathy in terms of how we relate emotionally to what's happening, but also kind of critically in terms of how we think about it in rational kind of deep thinking sort of fashions. That's what scares me, is that we need to fight against the dumbing down of civilization.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
We should be gone by 7.
Yeah.
So it's last question. Is the last question? Pensavo l'avessi visto.
No, volevo dire una roba sui libri.
Vai.
No, so the books they can be downloaded. The Spanish version will also be uploaded next week. These are for sale. We only have 5 copies. The cost is self-assessed. Okay, so you give it what you think it's worth and what you can. The money. So this time we didn't speak about the financial crisis for social movements as well. Anyway. No, it's real. It's real because there used to be government programs that could sponsor civil society, action. There used to be NGOs that could get those programs. Now everything is being cut back in Europe. So basically all the core funding for PHM is not there. But anyway, that's not to plead for money, but to say that we didn't pre-order the hard books because we didn't have the resources. So what we'll do with the money of these, we will just print other books, okay? And then if we don't print other books, the priority now for PHM in terms of fundraising is Gaza. So there is going to be a new fundraising for reconstructing the health sector there. So anyway, so that's our priority. And if you want to know more about PHM or be in touch, I mean, you just through Ivo or directly to us, we'd be more than happy to tell you more.
Should we say that they are now unofficially PHM activists?
Well,
No,
that's a bit.
by coming here,
I think that's a bit. How do you say? Okay.
It's great video.
We need to close the. Oh, and Ron and I will have a beer somewhere nearby. So whoever wants to come and spend a half an hour with us in a more informal setting, we've been together for a week, so we need a break. So please, somebody please, because Eva's not coming. He's really very bad. Okay, let's say bye to our friends at home. We need to close the computer. But Ivo, you can formally close actually.
I'm going to formally close by thanking Ron and Chiara very much for a brilliant presentation of Mobilizing for Justice. And I want also to thank all of you for being here this evening. And I want a copy of the book.
Okay, you deserve it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What the hell?
No, prima di tutto vedete poi se vi volete leggere, perché io avrò facilmente.
Ciao, no, beh, una prendila.
Sì, no, beh, vediamo. Io vi metto.
Allora, termina.